There is a strange thing about the most famous face on earth. Billions know it. Billions have watched it move across a screen, chase a ball, lift a trophy, cry on grass. And yet, almost no one has heard it speak. Not really. Not the way we think we know people. Lionel Messi has spent 30 years in front of cameras. He has given thousands of interviews. And still, after all of that, he remains a stranger. Con was it? Tonight, we are not going to talk about his goals. We are going to talk about his silence, where it came from, what it cost him, and what it was hiding. Let's start with a small room, somewhere in Rosario, Argentina, in the mid-1990s. A boy sits on an examination table. He is 7 years old. He is smaller than the other boys his age, smaller by a head, sometimes smaller by more. A doctor is speaking to his parents in low, careful words. The boy does not fully understand what is being said. He only understands the tone. Something is wrong with him. Something about his body has decided not to grow the way it should. The diagnosis will come to be known as a growth hormone deficiency. But the boy does not hear a diagnosis. He hears a verdict. He hears that he is different, and difference to a child does not feel like a medical term. It feels like a wall. What happens to a child who is told again and again that his body is a problem to be solved? He does not become louder. He does not demand attention. He learns instead to disappear. He learns to take up less space, because taking up space had already been declared by doctors, by classmates, by the shape of his own shadow, to be something dangerous. This is where the silence begins, not on a football pitch, not under stadium lights, in a doctor's office, in a small city, in the quiet after a sentence no child should have to hear. For years, Lionel had to give himself an injection every single night. Every night, without exception, a needle in his leg. Some nights his father did it. Some nights he did it himself. Imagine that, my friend. Imagine a boy of 8, 9, 10 years old, learning that his own body requires a small wound each night just to keep growing. There is no ceremony in that. No cameras, no crowd cheering him on. Just a child, alone in a room, doing something painful, quietly, because he has no other choice. Perhaps this is the first lesson Lionel Messi ever learned about pain, that it is private, that it does not need witnesses, that you can carry it, night after night, and never once mention it to the world. Now think about what this does to a personality, a boy who learns early that his body betrays him, that his voice draws unwanted attention, that being noticed brings pity rather than comfort, begins to build a different kind of armor, not the loud kind, not the kind that shouts back, the quiet kind, the kind that says nothing at all. Teachers who knew him in Rosario would later describe a boy who barely spoke in class, not because he had nothing to say, but because speaking felt like exposure, and exposure for this boy had never gone well. Then, at 13, everything changed, and nothing changed at once. Barcelona brought him to Spain. His talent was undeniable, obvious from the first touch of a ball, obvious to coaches who had seen thousands of children and had never seen anything like this one. But talent does not erase a personality. It only gives it a bigger stage. Imagine being 13 years old, taken from your home, your language slightly foreign in its accent, your friends left behind an ocean away, and told that you are now the future of one of the biggest football clubs on the planet. The talent grew. The silence grew with it. Teammates from La Masia, Barcelona's youth academy, would later recall a boy who almost never spoke first. He would sit at the edge of the group. He would eat quickly. He would go straight to his room, not out of arrogance, not out of coldness, out of something closer to fear, a fear that speaking, that being seen too closely, would invite the same kind of scrutiny that had followed him since that small room in Rosario. Some of his teammates thought he was simply shy. Others thought something deeper, a few years later, would say the same word. Lonely, a boy surrounded by hundreds of people and entirely alone inside himself. Here is something remarkable. As Lionel Messi's fame grew, his silence did not shrink to match it. It grew too. By the time he was 20, he was already being called the best player in the world by some. By the time he was 25, there was no debate left to have. And yet, put a microphone in front of him, and something strange happened. The man who could read a football pitch better than any human alive, who could see 3 passes ahead of every other player on the field, would freeze. His answers became short. His eyes would drop to the floor. His hands would find something to hold. A bottle, a jersey, anything. Journalists who covered Barcelona for years have a shared memory of this. Post-match interviews with Lionel Messi were famously brief. Reporters learned not to expect elaboration. They learned to ask short questions, because long ones would only be met with silence, or worse, a shrug. One reporter, describing this years later, said interviewing Messi felt like trying to have a conversation with a locked door. You could knock. Sometimes it opened a crack. Mostly it did not. Contrast this with almost anyone else at his level. Athletes who reach that height of fame usually learn, out of necessity, to perform charisma, to give the crowd what it wants, not just on the field, but off it. Lionel never learned this, or perhaps, more accurately, he refused to. Why refuse? This is the real question, because a refusal like this, sustained for 30 years in front of the entire world, is not an accident. It is a choice, even if that choice was made unconsciously, over and over since childhood. Perhaps the answer lies in what fame actually asks of a person. Fame asks you to be consumed. It asks you to hand over pieces of yourself, your opinions, your private moments, your unguarded reactions, so that strangers can feel closer to you. For most people, this exchange feels natural, even flattering. But for a boy who learned that being noticed meant being diagnosed, being pitied, being different, that exchange must have felt like a threat. There is a photograph, often shared online, of a very young Lionel at a Barcelona youth match. He is standing slightly apart from his teammates, his eyes fixed somewhere on the ground, his shoulders drawn in, as if trying to occupy less space than his body actually took up. Compare this to a photograph of him decades later, walking off a pitch after winning the World Cup. His eyes still, in many of these images, cast downward. His celebrations often brief before he turns and walks quietly to the tunnel. Something in that posture never changed. The trophies changed. The stadiums changed. The posture, remarkably, did not. Let's talk about a specific night. Barcelona, 2009. Lionel had just won his first Ballon d'Or, the award given to the best football player on the planet. This was, by any measure, one of the largest nights of his professional life. The ceremony was in Zurich. The room was full of legends, full of cameras, full of the kind of attention that most human beings spend their entire lives chasing. When Lionel walked up to accept the trophy, his speech lasted less than a minute. He thanked his family. He thanked his club. He walked off. Compare this to acceptance speeches from athletes in other sports, in other countries, speeches that stretch for minutes, filled with stories, jokes, tears. Gratitude poured out in long, generous streams. Lionel's speech was a whisper by comparison, not because the moment meant less to him, because the moment, in front of that many eyes, cost him something to endure at all. There is a myth that some athletes are naturally quiet, that this is simply their temperament, nothing more to examine. But those who have studied Lionel's life more closely point to something more specific. Friends from Rosario have said that away from cameras, away from strangers, Lionel is a different man entirely, loud with his closest friends, full of jokes, endlessly playful with his children. The silence, it turns out, is not a personality. It is a shield, raised specifically for the world outside his trusted circle. Think about what this means. The most famous man in football has spent 30 years building an entire public identity around not showing you who he actually is. Now here is where the story turns, because silence, held for long enough, in front of enough people, eventually becomes its own kind of language. Fans began to read meaning into Lionel's stillness. When he scored and did not celebrate wildly, they called it humility. When he sat quietly on the bench during difficult seasons, they called it dignity. When he wept, rarely, but publicly, at the 2016 Copa America defeat, the tears felt more powerful, precisely because they were so rare. A man who gives you nothing and then suddenly gives you tears, gives you something that feels almost sacred. Perhaps this is the strange gift buried inside Lionel's silence. In an era where athletes live stream their breakfast, where every emotion is broadcast in real time, where fame has become a constant performance of intimacy, Lionel Messi offered the opposite. He offered mystery, and mystery, in the modern world, has become one of the rarest currencies of all. But mystery has a cost, and the cost falls on the man carrying it. Imagine spending 3 decades being watched by millions and speaking to almost none of them. Imagine every silence being analyzed, every short answer being dissected by journalists searching for hidden meaning that may not even be there. Sometimes a short answer is not a mystery. Sometimes it is simply a tired man who does not know how to explain feelings he has never learned to put into words. There is something almost tragic in this. The man whose feet could express more nuance, more creativity, more emotion than perhaps any player in the history of the sport, could not find the same fluency in his own voice. Consider the 2021 press conference, the day Barcelona announced Lionel would leave the club after 21 years. This was, without argument, the most emotionally exposed the world had ever seen him. He sat at the podium. He tried to speak. The tears arrived before the words did. For a full, unbearable stretch of silence, the room simply waited, watching a man who had spent his entire life avoiding exactly this kind of exposure, now forced to sit in it, camera lights burning down on him, unable to hide. Pause. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. I was not prepared for this. I gave everything, from the first day to the last. I never imagined saying goodbye. Notice something about that sentence. It is short. It is plain. There is no elaborate performance in it, no rehearsed eloquence. It is the sentence of a man who has spent his life avoiding this exact moment, and who, even now, could only offer the barest, most honest version of what he felt. Perhaps that is the truest thing about Lionel Messi's silence. It was never about having nothing to say. It was about a body and a mind that had learned, since a small room in Rosario, decades earlier, that feelings were dangerous things to display in public, that being seen too closely had never once, in his entire life, led anywhere good. The needle every night, the classmates who noticed he was smaller, the reporters who wanted a quote, the crowds who wanted a smile, each one in its own way, asking him to open a door he had learned, very young, to keep shut. And yet, here is the paradox that makes this story worth telling. A man who could not find words managed, somehow, to become one of the most beloved figures in the history of sport, not despite his silence. In some strange way, because of it, fans did not fall in love with speeches. They fell in love with what his silence seemed to protect, an authenticity that felt rare in a world of manufactured charisma. When Lionel Messi finally did show emotion, when he cried on the grass in Lucail after winning the World Cup in 2022, when he dropped to his knees and looked up at the sky, the moment carried the full weight of every silence that came before it. 30 years of a closed door, and then, for a few seconds, it opened completely. The whole world was watching. And for once, there was nothing left to hide, because there was nothing left to want. He had given everything. The mask fell not because he chose to remove it, but because there was, finally, nothing left underneath to protect. Think about the arc of that. A boy who learned that being noticed brought pain, a teenager who built walls out of silence to survive being watched by an entire continent, a young man who gave the shortest possible answers to protect something private inside himself, a superstar who let almost no one close enough to know him, and then, at 35 years old, on a football pitch in Qatar, all of it breaking open at once, in front of 4 billion people, because the moment had finally become too large for even his silence to contain. There is a lesson buried somewhere in this story, though it does not arrive easily. We live in a world that rewards people for being loud, for sharing everything, for performing their emotions in real time, for an audience that demands constant access. Lionel Messi built one of the greatest careers in the history of any sport, while refusing almost entirely to participate in that performance. He let his feet speak a language his voice never learned. He let his silence become a kind of honesty, precisely because it never pretended to be anything other than what it was. Perhaps that is the real story hidden behind the goals and the trophies, not a machine, cold and efficient, incapable of feeling. A boy who learned, very early, that some things are too fragile to say out loud, and who spent the rest of his life proving that you can still give the world everything you have, even while keeping the most important parts of yourself entirely your own. So the next time you watch an old clip, a brief interview, a short answer given without elaboration, a celebration that ends almost as soon as it begins, look a little closer. You are not watching indifference. You are watching a small boy from Rosario, still inside a grown man's body, still deciding, after all these years, how much of himself is safe to give away. And maybe, my friend, there is something of that boy in you too. Maybe there are rooms in your own life where you learned it was safer to stay quiet. Maybe you too have built a version of yourself the world sees, and kept another version hidden away, trusted to almost no one. If Lionel Messi's story tells us anything, it is this: you do not have to be loud to be understood. Sometimes, the truest things about us are said without a single word.